The bakery on Clover Street smelled like brown sugar and cardamom on the morning my grandmother taught me to make her apple spice muffins. I was 7. She stood behind me with her hands over mine, guiding the wooden spoon in slow circles, and she said, "This recipe stays in this family, Jenna. You keep it safe." I thought she was talking about the muffins. She wasn't just talking about the muffins. My grandmother passed away on a Tuesday in late October. She'd been in and out of the hospital for 3 months. First the hip replacement that didn't heal right, then the infection, then the long, quiet decline that hospice nurses navigate with a kind of practiced gentleness that I will never stop being grateful for. I had taken unpaid leave from my job at the property management firm where I worked as a leasing coordinator. I moved into her house on Clover Street for the last 6 weeks of her life. I cooked for her. I drove her to her remaining appointments. I organized her paperwork, which she had kept in an old green accordion folder that smelled like cedar and rubber bands. My brother did not come until 4 days before she died. He lives 2 hours away. He has a truck and a flexible work schedule. He does contract HVAC installation, and in those 3 months he came twice. Once in August for a Sunday afternoon, once in September for her birthday, and only because I reminded him 3 times that week. Both times he stayed less than 4 hours and left before dinner. I didn't say much about it at the time. My grandmother did not want conflict in her house while she was still in it. She was very clear about that, so I bit my tongue and I kept driving her to her appointments, and I kept refilling her prescriptions, and I kept sleeping on the pull-out couch in her living room because the guest bed had too many boxes stacked on it to be useful, and I hadn't had the energy to move them. 4 days before she died, my brother showed up. He brought flowers, which she couldn't really smell anymore, and a grocery store pie, and his wife, who sat in the corner of the bedroom looking at her phone with the screen brightness all the way down like that, made it less obvious. My grandmother held his hand and told him she loved him, and he cried. And I stood in the doorway and watched and felt something that I still don't have the right word for. It was not anger exactly. It was something closer to exhaustion with a hard edge underneath it. What I didn't know then, what I found out later, was that my brother had spent a significant part of those 3 months working my grandmother. That's the only word that fits. He called her more often in her final weeks. He sent cards. He told her that he'd been struggling, that his business had hit a rough patch, that he was worried about money. He told her, and I found this out from her attorney after everything unraveled, that I had mentioned he might need some help, that I had suggested she think about him. I had never said that. I had never said anything remotely like that. My grandmother had a will. She had made it 4 years earlier with an attorney named Harold Webb, who had an office downtown above a UPS store and had been doing estate work in our county for 30 years. The will was straightforward. The house on Clover Street, which she owned outright, was to be sold and the proceeds split equally between her 2 grandchildren, my brother and me. Her savings account, which held around $94,000, was also to be split equally. There were a few specific Becks holds: her jewelry to me, her truck to my brother, her kitchen table and chairs to the church she attended. That was the will as I understood it. But in those final weeks, my grandmother had asked Harold Webb to come to the house. She had asked him to make changes. I found this out on the morning she died when Harold called me, not my brother, me, because I was listed as the executor, and told me gently that there had been an amendment to the will about 6 weeks prior. My grandmother, he said, had requested that the savings account go entirely to my brother given his financial hardship. The house proceeds were still to be split equally, but the $94,000 in savings would go to my brother alone. I sat on the pull-out couch in her living room while the hospice nurse was still in the next room, completing paperwork, and I read that sentence 3 times. I asked Harold if he had any concerns about her capacity at the time of the amendment. He paused. He said she had been lucid. He said she had answered all his questions correctly. He said he had no legal grounds to refuse the amendment. But then he said quietly, the way people say things they can't say officially, "She did mention your brother several times. She seemed very worried about him. She kept saying he had told her you both agreed it was the right thing." I said, "I never agreed to that." Harold paused again. Then he said, "I didn't think so." My brother arrived at the house around 11 that morning. My grandmother had passed at 6:42. He had been informed by phone. He came in, hugged me, cried again, sat at the kitchen table. His wife went straight to my grandmother's bedroom, and I heard drawers opening. I did not say anything about the will yet. I had learned, in the years of watching my brother operate, that he performs best when he believes he has the advantage. I wanted to understand the full picture first. What I found over the next 2 weeks was worse than I expected. My brother had not just influenced the will amendment, he had also, about 3 weeks before my grandmother died, called her bank directly. He had her account number, she had shared it with him years ago for an emergency situation that no longer applied, and he had called the bank's customer service line and asked about the process for adding a joint account holder. The bank representative, following standard procedure, had sent a form to my grandmother's address. My grandmother, who was on pain medication and trusting of anything that came in an official-looking envelope, had signed it without fully understanding what it was. My brother had become a joint account holder on her savings account. That meant the amendment to the will was, from his perspective, almost irrelevant. He already had access. He withdrew $47,000 the week she died. I found out because I was the executor, and I requested account statements as part of the estate process. The bank statement arrived on a Thursday. I sat at my kitchen table, back in my own apartment by then, and I looked at that number for a long time. I called my attorney. I had started working with an estate attorney named Paula Reeves about 10 days after my grandmother passed, because something had felt wrong from the beginning and I wanted someone in my corner before I fully understood how wrong. Paula listened to everything I had just found out. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Okay, here's what I need you to do." What Paula explained was this: the joint account situation was potentially actionable because there was evidence, the phone records, the bank's call logs. The fact that my grandmother had been on pain medication when the form arrived, that suggested my grandmother had not fully understood what she was signing. This was not a certainty. Courts are complicated and elder financial abuse cases are difficult to prove, but the evidence was not nothing. Additionally, the will amendment, while legally executed, had been made under circumstances that might constitute undue influence if we could demonstrate that my brother had misrepresented my position to her. Paula said the word misrepresented carefully. What she meant was, he lied to a dying woman about what her granddaughter had said, and used that lie to redirect her assets. I did not sleep well that week. What made everything more complicated was that my brother did not know what I knew. He thought the estate process was moving normally. He had sent me a few texts asking about the timeline for the house sale, cordial texts, the kind he sends when he thinks everything is going his way. He had mentioned once, casually, that he was thinking about using some of his inheritance to take a vacation. He said he and his wife had been stressed. He said they were thinking about Hawaii. He said it the way someone says something to see how you react. I reacted by saying, "Sounds nice," and then calling Paula. Paula sent a letter to my brother's attorney. He had retained one which told me he had anticipated some kind of dispute, outlining our position and requesting documentation related to the account change and the will amendment. The letter was detailed and it was not friendly. It cited specific statutes related to elder financial abuse in our state and requested that my brother voluntarily return the $47,000 that had been withdrawn prior to our grandmother's death, pending a full accounting of the estate. My brother called me that evening. He was not cordial. He said I was being vindictive. He said I had always resented him for being closer to our grandmother. He said I'd only moved in with her at the end to secure my position in the will, which was, and I want to be precise here, almost funny, given the facts on the ground. He said he had done nothing wrong. He said our grandmother wanted him to have that money, and she told him so directly. He said if I pursued this, I was going to destroy our relationship. I said, "Tell me which part of that is supposed to stop me." He hung up. The next 3 months were not fun. I will not pretend otherwise. There were more attorney letters, more phone calls with Paula, more late nights reading through documents and trying to understand things I had never wanted to have to understand. My mother, who is my brother's and my only remaining parent, stayed almost entirely out of it, which I respected even when it was hard. She said once, quietly, over the phone, "I know what he did, Jenna. I just can't be in the middle of it." I told her I understood. I mostly understood. What happened in the end was a settlement. My brother did not want to go to court. His attorney, I think, had given him a realistic picture of what the bank call logs in the timeline looked like in front of a judge. He agreed to return $38,000 of the $47,000, The remainder had apparently already been spent, which is its own kind of statement, and he agreed to waive any additional claim to the savings account under the will amendment. The house proceeds were split as originally intended, 50-50. It was not a perfect outcome. I had wanted the full $47,000. Paula told me that settlements rarely give you everything and that what we had gotten was, given the difficulty of proving intent in cases like this, genuinely good. I believed her. I still felt the $9,000 loss like a bruise. On the day the settlement was finalized, I drove to Clover Street. The house had not yet sold. It was listed, but the market was slow that winter. And I had a key. I let myself in, through the back door. The one that sticks in the frame the same way it has since I was a child, and I stood in my grandmother's kitchen. The table was still there. The church hadn't come to collect it yet. The accordion folder was gone. I had taken it for the estate paperwork. But the shelf above the stove still had her collection of ceramic roosters, which no one had claimed, and which I had been quietly planning to take for months. I tipped the roosters. I put them in a box. I sat at the table for a while. I'd thought about the morning she taught me to make the apple spice muffins, the way she guided the wooden spoon in slow circles, the way she said, "This stays in the family, keep it safe." I had thought she was being sentimental about a recipe. But she had spent her whole life building something. That house, that savings account, the security of knowing she could leave something behind. And she trusted the people she loved to be worthy of it. My brother made a choice. He made several choices, each one smaller and more calculated than the last, and he made them while I was at her bedside and while I was driving to her pharmacy and while I was sleeping on a pull-out couch so I could be nearby if she needed anything at 3 in the morning. He thought I wouldn't find out, or maybe he thought I would find out and wouldn't do anything. I'm not sure which version of me he had decided he was dealing with. Neither version was accurate. The house sold in February. My half of the proceeds, combined with the returned funds and the remaining savings, came to slightly more than I had expected when I first sat in Harold Webb's office and understood what had happened. It wasn't a windfall. It was my grandmother's life's work, and I held it accordingly. I put a portion of it into a high-yield savings account. I used some of it to pay off the last of my student loans, which my grandmother had always known about and always asked me about with a small, worried crease between her eyebrows. I used a small portion to take a long weekend in Savannah, Georgia in the spring, because I had not taken a real day off in 8 months and I needed to sit somewhere beautiful and eat good food and breathe. I sent my brother a text when the settlement check cleared. I told him I hoped he was doing okay. I told him I didn't want to be estranged forever. I told him that what he had done had caused real damage, and that I needed him to understand that before we could move forward. He read it. He didn't respond for 11 days. When he did, he said he was sorry things had gotten complicated. Not that he was sorry for what he did. That he was sorry for what he did. That he was sorry things had gotten complicated. I saved the text, I'm not sure why. Evidence of something, I suppose. What I know is this. My grandmother put her hands over mine at a kitchen counter when I was 7 years old, and she told me to keep things safe. She meant more than a recipe, and I understood that eventually, and I did what I could with the understanding I had. I can't change what my brother did or what she believed when she signed those papers. I can only account for what I did when I found out. The ceramic roosters are on the shelf above my own stove now. When the morning light comes through the window at the right angle, they look almost exactly the way they did on Clover Street. And I take that for what it is. There's something I keep coming back to. Months after the settlement cleared and the house on Clover Street passed to someone else's family. It's not the $9,000 I didn't recover. It's not even the amendment to the will or the bank form my grandmother signed without understanding what she was signing. It's the fact that my brother made his choices slowly, carefully, over weeks, and he made them while I was already there, already doing the work. Already sleeping on a pull-out couch so I could be nearby if she needed water at 2 in the morning. He didn't act in spite of what I was doing. He acted because of it. He knew I was occupied. He knew I was tired. He counted on it. That's the part I had to sit with for a long time. I don't think my brother is a monster. I think he is someone who wanted something and told himself a story about why he deserved it, and then told that story to a woman who was dying and who loved him and who didn't have the clarity left to question it. That's not a monster. That's something almost more ordinary and more disappointing than a monster. It's a person who looked at a situation and decided that what he could get mattered more than what was right. People make that calculation every day. Most of them just don't make it in a hospice bedroom. What I learned, and I mean learned in the way that actually changes how you move through the world, not just something you say you learned, is that doing the right thing is not the same as being protected. I was there, I showed up. I gave 8 months of my life to my grandmother's care without resentment and without expectation, and none of that stopped what happened. Goodness on its own is not a shield. What helped was paying attention, calling Harold Webb when something felt off, retaining Paula before I fully understood why I needed her, reading the bank statements even when I was exhausted and wanted it to be over. The decisions that protected me weren't dramatic. They were quiet and unglamorous, and I made them while I was also grieving. That's what I mean when I say that clarity under pressure is something you have to practice, not something you just have. My brother assumed I would be too emotional, too busy, too drained to look closely. He was wrong about what grief does to some people. For some people, grief sharpens things. And then there was the part that took the most out of me, actually following through. Filing the paperwork. Sitting in Paula's office and saying, yes, we are doing this, even though he's my brother and my mother is watching and this will change things permanently. That took something I didn't know I had until I needed it, not anger. Anger is easy. Something quieter and more stubborn than anger. The willingness to keep going when it would have been so much easier to let it go and tell myself it didn't matter. It mattered. The $47,000 mattered, yes. But more than that, what my grandmother spent her life building mattered. The truth of what happened mattered. My own sense of what I was willing to accept mattered. The ceramic roosters are on my shelf now. They catch the morning light the same way they did on Clover Street. I didn't fight for them. No one wanted them but me. But I think about them sometimes as the thing I would have kept, even if I'd lost everything else. Some things hold a person's whole life in them. My grandmother knew that. I know it now too.